This is Land of Havilah, John 18a. They ate the Last Supper, and by the time they finished, it was night, John 13:30. Jesus gave them final instructions. He prayed for them. Then, verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden into which he and his disciples entered. Comment: the brook Kidron was less than a quarter mile outside the city wall. They crossed over the brook to a garden called Gethsemane at the base of the Mount of Olives, Matthew 26:36 and 14:32. Verse 2. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Judas then, having taken a detachment of soldiers and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Comment: Jesus and the disciples spent the night at the Garden of Gethsemane habitually, Luke 21:37, 22:39, and Matthew 26:36. Therefore Judas knew where to look. The soldiers and officers were under orders from, quote, the chief priests and Pharisees. Verse 4. Jesus, therefore, knowing all the things that were happening to him, went out and said to them, "Who are you looking for?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas also, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When therefore he said to them, "I am he," they went backward and fell to the ground. Again, therefore, he asked them, "Who are you looking for?" They said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If therefore you seek me, let these go their way, that the word might be fulfilled which he spoke, of those whom you have given me I have lost none. Simon Peter, therefore, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus therefore said to Peter, "Put the sword into its sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not surely drink it?" Comment: in verse 4, Jesus cooperated with the arrest. He knew the soldiers and officers were looking for him, but ultimately it was he who approached them and said, "Who are you looking for?" When he said, "I am he," the soldiers and officers fell to the ground. There's no explanation given why they fell, and curiously, according to the NET Bible translation notes, scholars have debated the explanation, trying to assign some sort of natural cause to it. It seems obvious the soldiers and officers fell under the power of God. The power of God that kept them from arresting Jesus in the past, John 7:44 and 45, was present again. This going backward and falling down was testimony from God to any who would be reading about it in the future that Jesus still had protection if he wanted it. Peter cut off the servant's right ear, but Jesus touched it and healed it on the spot, Luke 22:51. The water to wine was his first miracle, John 2:11, and this was probably his last. As recorded in Matthew 26:52 and 53, Jesus told Peter to put his sword away. Quote, "Do you think that I couldn't ask my Father, and he would even now send me more than 12 legions of angels?" End quote. That was more evidence that the Father would have supported Jesus if Jesus had said the word. But having the option to completely avoid what was coming, he went through with it. He laid down his life for his friends, John 15:13. When they fell, he almost had to revive them to get up and do their jobs. He had to start over and ask them again, "Who are you looking for?" And again he said, "I told you I am he." Though he cooperated, he never crossed the line into encouraging them. They imposed it on him, and he didn't resist. Verse 12. So the detachment, the commanding officer, and the officers of the Jews seized Jesus and bound him, and led him to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should perish for the people. Comment: in verse 13, Caiaphas was high priest that year. The Gospels mention the term chief priests in the plural 54 times and alternately call Annas the high priest or Caiaphas the high priest, which is strange because ordinarily we would expect there to be only one chief priest, Numbers 35:25. There have been several explanations advanced as to why Annas and Caiaphas are both called high priest, but according to the extra-biblical historian Josephus, Annas was priest from 6 AD to 15 AD, but the Roman prefect Valerius Gratus removed him from office. Since the office of high priest was rightly regulated by the law of Moses and not by Roman law, it seems plausible and even likely that the Jews continued to recognize Annas as the rightful high priest, while Caiaphas was the official high priest as far as the Romans were concerned. Therefore, as it says in the Gospels, there were two of them. In verse 13, they took Jesus to Annas first. Now verse 15. Simon Peter followed Jesus, as did another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest, and entered in with Jesus into the court of the high priest. But Peter was standing at the door outside. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to her who kept the door, and brought in Peter. Comment: Peter and another disciple followed Jesus and the soldiers to the house of the high priest. John doesn't mention the name of the second disciple. It was almost certainly himself. He didn't use his own name anywhere in his gospel. His name's prominent in the other gospels, but conspicuous in its absence in this gospel. So we naturally conclude that whenever he refers to a disciple and avoids mentioning the name, when it would have been easier to use the name, he's probably talking about himself. So we could assume that the unnamed disciple who followed was John, along with Peter. He'll be in the courtyard coming up when Peter denies Jesus. In the book of Mark, another young man followed part of the way, wearing only a linen garment over his naked body. They tried to arrest him as well, but they only got his garment, and he escaped completely naked. Mark doesn't name him, but it sounds curiously like it could be Mark himself. Mark 14:51 and 52. Verse 15 says John was able to get in the high priest's courtyard because he was, quote, known to the high priest, and from there he was able to talk to the girl at the door to let Peter in. Now coming up, we should recall from the Last Supper that Peter told Jesus, quote, I will lay down my life for you, end quote. But Jesus told him, quote, most certainly I tell you, the rooster won't crow until you have denied me 3 times. John 13:38. Verse 17. Then the maid who kept the door said to Peter, Are you also one of this man's disciples? He said, I am not. Now the servants and the officers were standing there, having made a fire of coals, for it was cold. They were warming themselves. Peter was with them, standing and warming himself. Comment: that was the first denial. As Peter's warming himself by the fire in the courtyard, the camera now shifts inside the house to Annas interviewing Jesus. Verse 19. The high priest, therefore, asked Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered him, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple where the Jews always meet. I said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Behold, these know the things which I said. Comment: Annas asked Jesus about his disciples, and from what's recorded here and in the other Gospels, Jesus kept his disciples out of it. He already said in verse 8 when they arrested him in the garden, quote, let these go their way, end quote, speaking of the disciples. Annas also asked Jesus about his teaching in verse 19, but Jesus only said, quote, ask those who heard me. He's completely done preaching in the flesh. If you and I want to know what he said, we can still consult those who heard him. Verse 22. When he had said this, one of the officers standing by slapped Jesus with his hand, saying, Do you answer the high priest like that? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, testify of the evil, but if well, why do you beat me? Comment: Jesus' only offense that he was slapped was that he asked for witnesses, quote, ask those who heard me. He was going to get slapped either way. If he had preached to Annas and told him he was the Christ, he would have been slapped for that, so there was no use. Verse 24. Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Comment: now the camera goes back outside. Verse 25. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. They said therefore to him, You aren't also one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, being a relative of him whose ear Peter had cut off, said, Didn't I see you in the garden with him? Peter therefore denied it again, and immediately the rooster crowed. Comment: in the book of Revelation, the persons who will overcome during the Great Tribulation will be the ones who stay true to their testimony, loving not their lives even to death. Revelation 12:11. Peter had complete mental resolve that he would follow Jesus to death, but his resolve wasn't enough. The resolutions of men fail. We depend on God that what we resolve in our frailty, He'll establish in His strength. There's going to be a big difference in the Peter of this chapter who didn't perform up to his own expectations, and the Peter of Acts chapter 2 who will be baptized in the Holy Spirit and outperform everyone's expectations. John 18b is next at landofhavilah.net. John 18b.